Hello, and thank you for accessing this summer update on the ITE thematic monitoring visits that we have carried out this academic year. As many of you will know, my name is Andrea Shepherd and I am the Senior His Majesty's Inspector responsible for teacher development here at Ofsted. This update will provide some of the headlines from those TMV visits that we carried out across the spring and summer terms in 2025. There will be an overview report and a webinar to follow. So if we start first with just some reminders of what the TMVs were about. The TMVs were a type of assurance activity and they were designed to help us to maintain an oversight of the ITE sector during the time that we had paused our routine ITE inspections. They involved teams of inspectors visiting providers to gather evidence in relation to specific themes for each of the different phases of ITE. We didn't make judgments about any of those individual providers that we visited, and we are now collating those findings into an overview report that will be published on the Ofsted website. What this work has done is it's enabled us to gather and analyse some very rich information about good practice across the sector and some of the challenges that providers are facing. And this will help us to inform our training and to inform our inspection practice as we move forwards. And the report will enable us to highlight, without identifying any individual providers, of course, where we can work together to bring about further improvements. And we do hope that the findings and the report will be useful to you as providers. So as a summary of the visits, we actually carried out 78 TMVs, and that gave us access. We looked then at 100 phases of ITE. You can see there on the screen the profile of those phases, but that involved us visiting 44 school-centred ITT providers, 14 universities, 13 FE colleges, 6 independent learning providers, and 1 local authority. So we've visited a wide range of provider types and provider sizes, and we were able to carry out those visits in all 4 phases of ITE. And as you will remember, the themes were designed to reflect the changes and the new sector requirements in each of those ITE phases. So if we start with the early years, and a quick reminder of the themes for that particular phase. So we asked in early years the following questions. How successful were the arrangements made by providers for their trainees to receive high quality mentoring? How well did providers prepare trainees to teach children with SEND and to carry out their future roles and responsibilities in the early identification of SEND? And the third theme was about the effectiveness of the ITE curriculum in developing trainees' understanding of the learning and development requirements of the EYFS statutory framework. And this was particularly about the development of trainees and the development of their knowledge in order to be able to teach communication and language. Thinking about the first of those themes then, in relation to mentoring. And it was clear to us that providers understand well the importance of effective mentoring for trainees and the positive impact that it can have on the progress of those trainees. Typically, leaders set high expectations for mentoring right from the very outset of their programmes. And we've seen that communicated through mentor training that sets out those high expectations, as well as the weekly requirements for activities, whether they'll be weekly meetings or observations of trainees in the workplace. Provider leaders strongly encourage mentors to attend the training that is put on for them, but there does continue to be challenges with mentors being released from their settings to attend the training. And sometimes that might be due to staffing levels, it might be due to funding, it might be due to other reasons. But there are ongoing challenges with mentors being able to fulfill the requirements for training and the weekly meetings with trainees. Overall, trainees speak highly of the support and the challenge that they get from their mentors in the early years ITE phase. Across the thematic monitoring visits in the early years phase, the evidence has shown to us that every provider also places a high importance on preparing trainees to be teachers of SEND. In some providers, we've seen the teaching of that content relating to SEND being particularly front loaded, whereas in others, it's much more woven through the modules. High quality research underpins what the trainees learn, and many providers use external expertise to support that training. And most mentors, through that mentor training that they receive, typically keep up to date with what trainees learn about SEND and the research that underpins this. However, there are occasions where we found that mentors, in some settings, feel that they maybe lack sufficient SEND knowledge, and this does have an impact on how well they're able to then support their trainees to apply that theoretical knowledge into practice, to translate that into practice. We've seen a number of examples where trainees are supported to visit specialist settings or mainstream settings with high proportions of children with special educational needs and or disabilities. And in some providers, we've seen a very keen focus on those challenges that some children have with speech, language and communication. And what this then does is provide those trainees with an in-depth knowledge of interventions and of structured play. And many trainees learn that adaptive teaching actually goes beyond those children with SEND. And these strategies are important for any children with barriers to their learning and or to their well-being. And this means that from the beginning of the IT programs, trainees are alert to the subtle ways that children's development might differ from what is termed as being expected. And usually those trainees are learning all about the requirements of the SEND Code of Practice, with important focus on legislation, policies, the four broad areas of need, and of course, multi-agency working. And the final theme in early years related, as we know, to the EYFS and more specifically to communication and language. In all providers visited, again, we saw the design of the curriculum that was done in a way that developed trainees' understanding of the EYFS statutory framework. Typically, this was underpinned with relevant research and linked to non-statutory development matters guidance. And as with SEND, there are differences in approaches. Of course, there are. We would expect to see that. And again, some providers front loading the content, where others take more of an integrated approach. And it was pleasing to see the way in which all providers ensured that the teaching practice that trainees were completing reinforced what they were learning about in their centre-based training. As with everything else linked to ITE, we do, of course, know that mentors play a key role in guiding trainees with this important aspect of the ITE curriculum. And this was particularly the case here in the feedback that they provide after trainees have been observed teaching. And generally, we did see some positive examples of this. However, in just a small number of providers, we did still see that target setting after those observations is still focused on tasks as opposed to those specific examples of what trainees can do to improve their teaching practice. So moving on now from early years into the primary and secondary phases of ITE. And we did cover each of these phases separately in many of the TMVs, and the final report will reflect this. But for the purposes of this summary recording, as we did in the spring, we will combine the findings for the two phases as the themes did relate to both of them. As just done with the early years, I will start with a quick reminder of what those themes were in the primary and secondary phases. So the first of these was about how successful providers have been in implementing intensive training and practice within their primary and secondary programmes. And this was specifically about how well those ITAPs are integrated into the ITE curriculum for trainees. We also asked how successful are the arrangements that providers implement to ensure that all trainees benefit from the high quality mentoring that they are entitled to. And in those relevant providers, how effective the accredited providers have been in developing partnerships and ensuring that they have sufficient oversight of the quality of education and training within their lead partners. So if we start with the first theme then around ITAPs, and we've learnt a lot throughout those TMVs about the different ways in which providers have implemented the requirements for ITAPs. And actually, this is where we saw that the greatest variety across the different providers that we visited. It was clear to us that providers carefully follow the DfE guidance on the allocation of time, and that the selection of ITAP themes was generally well thought out. And often that was done in consultation with other stakeholders. And we saw a whole variety of topics for those ITAPs: behaviour management, routines, transitions, low-level disruption, literacy, cognitive science, formative assessment, questioning, explanations. The list goes on. There were many, many different topics that we came across during our visits. And most providers were able to find an appropriate balance in the specificity of what they were focusing on for the ITAPs and the amount of detail that was included. However, we did come across some examples where the focus areas were too broad, and for those trainees, they didn't get the same depth of experience or the same depth of knowledge into that particular focus area. The timing, sequencing, and approach to the delivery of ITAPs varies, and the different points in the year that those happen and the way in which those particular ITAPs are structured, whether that being in blocks, spread out over a period of time, or a combination of the two. And having run things through for at least a year now, many providers continue to reflect and to ensure that they have sequenced their ITAPs in the way that brings the greatest benefit for their trainees. Logistical arrangements are one of the most frequently cited challenges around the implementation of ITAPs, and other challenges include things such as subject specificity for trainees in the secondary phase. Typically, again, trainees do speak highly of the impact of ITAP on the depth of their knowledge and understanding and on their development of their teaching practice. As we looked at mentoring as it applies in the primary and secondary phases of ITE, again, we were able to see those clear, precise, and often ambitious expectations from provider leaders for the mentors who support trainees on their ITE programmes. What we did actually see as well is, despite the relaxation in the requirements, many providers did actually maintain the 20 hours of training for mentors. And as well as that training, most mentors benefit from ongoing communication, such as conferences, newsletters, weekly emails, and training videos, to name just a few. And what we've actually seen in some providers now is almost a shift from that thinking about mentor training to actually thinking about the continual professional development and learning of mentors, and to keep those mentors up to date with the materials that are being taught in the ITE curriculum. Trainees do value very much the support that they receive from their mentors. What we have seen, though, is the training for those mentors that are in the second placement doesn't always bring those mentors to the same level of understanding about the curriculum as those mentors who support the trainees in their first placements. And thinking again about challenges, as we asked in all of the themes, the ongoing challenges for providers with ensuring high quality mentoring are linked to things such as the geographical dispersion of the schools, continuity of mentors where there might need to be a change, and sometimes the capacity in the schools. In all of the phases, as you will know, we had the theme around SEND. And in the primary and secondary phases, this was often described to us as being built into the curriculum rather than bolted on. We again saw examples of some more front loaded, some more woven through the curriculum, but SEND has a high profile, and there are many aspects of the curriculum that are often designed around SEND content. There were some examples that we saw where the sequencing did hamper trainees learning a little, and some of the content didn't seem to have a natural and a logical flow. But what we did see was relevant and up-to-date research informing and underpinning the coverage of SEND in the ITE curriculum. And in a number of providers, we saw experts from within the network linked to that provider or external experts being brought in to either support the curriculum or to support the delivery and the teaching of that curriculum. And to ensure mentors are up to date, some providers deliberately supplement their mentor training with additional information about SEND. And most trainees actually then report being able to try out what they have learnt in a timely way. Sometimes that's not quite as possible as people would want it to be. And sometimes what those trainees find is what they're learning about in the curriculum and the research that they're being taught about is at a more advanced stage than some of the practices that they see in their school setting. But what SEND in the ITE curriculum for primary and secondary phase trainees is providing is a situation whereby those trainees and the ECTs report growing confidence in teaching pupils who have SEND. And the final theme for these two phases was around partnerships and exploring the development of the accredited provider and lead partner relationships. And we've seen the approach to establishing those partnerships with lead partners has been varied across the accredited providers that have chosen to work in this way. We've seen some lead partners that deliver only aspects of the curriculum that may even only be linked to ITAP. And then in other cases, we've seen lead partners with a role where they are responsible for trainees, and in some cases, a large number of trainees. Some of those relationships more recently have been seen as temporary, while the lead partner was able to regain their accreditation as an accredited provider in their own right. And of course, as you might expect, some of those relationships between the accredited providers and their lead partners are at different stages of maturity. Lead partners, however, are clear about their role in the curriculum. And generally, those lead partners have spoken to us positively about the relationship that they have with their accredited provider. And then finally, we move to the ITE for FE and skills phase. And importantly for this phase, we visited a range of provider types. So we visited universities and we visited colleges, but we also visited independent learning providers. And as I mentioned at the start, we visited a local authority. What that group of providers also included was a mix of people who have in the past been subject to an ITE inspection. And we've also been able to visit a number of providers who've not previously been subject to an ITE inspection. Again, just a quick reminder of those themes. The first question that we asked was, how successful have providers been in implementing the Diploma in Teaching, Further Education and Skills qualification framework and or the Learning and Skills Teacher Occupational Standard? And within that, we were specifically looking at the curriculum, thinking about subject specificity, the quality of teaching practice, and the effectiveness of mentoring. As with early years primary and secondary, we also asked about the preparedness of trainees to teach learners with SEND. We asked about the effectiveness of arrangements for quality assurance and oversight between providers delivering ITE for FE and skills in partnership for others, in particular, of course, those working in validated arrangements. And where relevant, we asked about how providers were implementing the Level 5 Learning and Skills Apprenticeship Standard. And this was particularly focusing on the development of knowledge, skills, and behaviours that were relevant to teaching the subject well in the FE and skills sector. So if we take first then what we found in relation to the new Diploma in Teaching. And what we've seen is how providers have been updating their curriculum over the last few months and years for trainees embarking on the new diploma. However, there are still some examples of providers still teaching content that is outdated and contested. As required by the new framework, we can now see trainees generally having suitable first placements that help them to develop their teaching skills. In some providers, there's a little more work to be done as trainees are progressing through the programme and as they were preparing for second placements. Trainees are benefiting from subject-specific placements, and in most cases, they do have subject-specific mentors. And we are now starting to see examples of increasing subject specificity in the curriculum. But we do acknowledge, some providers acknowledge too, that there is some more work to be done just by some of those providers to ensure that trainees are taught the pedagogical content knowledge that they need to teach their subject well. And there were a number of aspects we looked at for this particular theme, one of those being mentoring. And we've seen some positive and some strong examples of mentoring for trainees. But overall, the quality of mentoring available for trainees in preparing to teach in the FE and skills sector is still variable. And in some providers, what that means is that mentors aren't always as clear enough about what their role is and their role in the subject-specific elements of the teaching. For the teaching of trainees and the preparedness of trainees to teach learners with SEND, again, most providers do support trainees to develop an appropriate understanding of how to teach learners that they may have with SEND. However, in some providers, the quality of this is impacted negatively by the training for staff. And what that leads to is maybe sometimes there's outdated language or some outdated theories that are taught to the trainees about how they might support learners with SEND or with other needs in the classroom. Trainees in some providers, and we have seen some positive examples of how trainees in those providers have been taught about and are learning about and are practicing working with different learning support staff and involving them in the planning and delivery of their teaching sessions. And those trainees in particular who are preparing to teach in specialist settings do describe their training as being highly beneficial. In relation to partnerships, partnerships in ITE for FE and skills are not new, and we've seen some examples of positive, long-standing and highly effective relationships between validating universities and their partner colleges. And a result of those relationships, then we see high levels of oversight, different models of quality assurance, and different levels of quality assurance that those university staff carry out in their partner colleges who are delivering ITE on a validated basis. But in those providers then who have only direct delivery, there are different arrangements for quality assurance, as you might expect, and there isn't then the validating university to carry out those additional quality assurance processes. And there is significant variation in how this is carried out. On occasion, those quality assurance mechanisms that are put in place across the provision don't give leaders enough oversight of the effectiveness of the ITE curriculum. And that then leads to some of the challenges that were highlighted in relation to the implementation of the DIT when I talked about theme 1 in this phase. And then finally, when we visited providers who were delivering the level 5 learning and skills teacher standard, we did ask some additional questions to understand about the development of knowledge, relevant knowledge, skills and behaviours as they apply to teaching a subject in the FE and skills sector. And many providers that we visited have a clear and appropriate rationale for their offer, including the level 5 learning and skills teacher. And many of those were providers who either wanted to train their own staff to be high quality teachers or to work with other providers to do just the same, and had spotted opportunities in the market to be able to do just that. And we can see the focus then of training and development to enable those trainees to learn about teaching in the FE and skills sector. But what we are still finding in some providers is that trainees are employed in school settings, some even working in primary school settings, which is a situation where this standard is not appropriate and doesn't provide the trainees with the knowledge, skills and behaviours that they need to carry out that role in a school setting. Now, of course, we do acknowledge there are some school settings where it may be appropriate for an apprentice to be undertaking this learning and skills standard, but those are occasional situations, and we are still seeing trainees recruited to these programs who are either in a school setting or in some cases who already have quite a high level of prior knowledge and skills. All of that said, what we're generally seeing, particularly where the provision is preparing trainees well to teach in the FE and skills sector, is a well-structured curriculum. But there are similarities to what we were seeing for those providers who offer the diploma in teaching, and that there are variances in elements of that, such as the quality of mentoring that trainees receive. So, in summary, we're delighted with the TMV project and how those findings from each of those different themes have come together, and they will be really useful to us in developing our understanding of the implementation of curriculum changes, market regulations, and we hope that those findings are useful to providers too. So I do want to say a really big thank you to those providers who took part in the TMVs. And speaking personally, it was an absolute pleasure to be able to visit so many providers to talk to leaders about their ITE provision outside of an inspection setting. So thank you very much to all those providers once again. So the next steps from here. We plan to publish the full TMV report at the end of September, and there will be a webinar on the 1st of October to accompany that report, where you will be able to hear more detail about the findings, and you will be able to submit questions in advance that we will aim to answer throughout that webinar. And once again, thank you. Thank you for your time and thank you for taking part.